My mother looked me in the eye and told me my medical school tuition would have to wait another year because my sister needed $40,000 for a wedding venue overlooking the ocean, and I remember the exact way the coffee cup felt in my hand, still warm, while my whole future turned cold. My name is Rachel, and for as long as I can remember I was the responsible one. The one who got straight A's without being asked twice. The one who worked at the diner on weekends starting at 16 so I wouldn't have to ask my parents for gas money. The one who never caused problems because I understood, even as a kid, that my parents didn't have much room in their hearts or their bank account for two daughters who both wanted things. My sister Melissa is 2 years younger than me, and from the day she was born she was the sun in our house. Everyone orbited her. If she cried, the whole family stopped moving. If she wanted a horseback riding lesson, my mother found the money somehow. If I wanted new shoes for track season, I was told to make do with what I had. I'm not saying this out of bitterness, I'm saying it because it's true, and because you need to understand it to understand what came later. I worked through college. Every single semester. I waited tables, I tutored freshmen in chemistry, I took out loans I still pay off today. My parents helped with exactly one semester of my tuition, my sophomore year, and even then my mother reminded me constantly what a sacrifice it was for the family. Meanwhile, Melissa's community college tuition was paid in full, no loans, no jobs, because as my mother put it, Melissa was more sensitive and needed to focus on her studies without distraction. I got into medical school on my third application, after 2 years of retaking the MCAT while working full-time. When I called home to tell them, my mother's first words were, "That's wonderful, honey," and then, "So listen, we need to talk about something important." That something important was Melissa's wedding. Melissa had gotten engaged to a man named Trevor, a nice enough guy from what I could tell, and the wedding she wanted was not a backyard barbecue kind of wedding. It was an oceanfront resort in Cabo, 80 guests, a live band flown in from Nashville, a photographer with a 2-year waiting list. The estimated cost was $90,000, and my parents, who had spent their entire lives telling me there was no money for anything, had apparently found $90,000 sitting somewhere. Here's the part that still makes my hands shake when I think about it. My acceptance letter came with a financial aid package that covered most of my first year, but there was a gap, a tuition gap of about $40,000 I needed to bridge with a private loan, and the loan required a cosigner because I had no established credit history and no collateral. My father had cosigned loans before for relatives, for my uncle's failed restaurant, for a cousin's car. This was routine for our family. So I asked. My mother sat me down at the kitchen table, the same table where I'd done homework every night of my childhood, and she told me that this year, financially, was simply not the year for that. She said Melissa's wedding deposit was due, the venue required $40,000 up front to hold the date, and if we didn't send it Melissa would lose her dream wedding and probably her relationship with Trevor's family who had certain expectations. I remember asking, quietly, so quietly, what about my medical school? My mother said, "Rachel, you're smart, you'll figure it out, you always do. Melissa needs us right now. Your sister is not built like you, she can't just push through things." I want you to sit with that sentence for a second, because I did, for years. Your sister can't just push through things. As if my entire life of pushing through things was a personality flaw instead of a survival skill I'd been forced to develop because nobody ever pushed for me. I didn't cry in front of her. I want you to know that, because it matters later. I said okay, and I went home, and I sat on my bathroom floor for 3 hours trying to figure out how a family could love one daughter's happiness so much more than the other daughter's future. I found a way, eventually. A cosigner through a family friend of my roommates, at a worse interest rate, a private loan that would follow me for the next 15 years like a shadow with teeth. I started medical school 2 months after that conversation, exhausted, underslept, quietly furious in a way I didn't have language for yet. And Melissa got her wedding. I flew to Cabo for it, because despite everything, I loved my sister, or at least I loved the sister I remembered from before all this money math started happening between us. I stood in the sand in a bridesmaid dress that cost $400, a dress I put on a credit card because there was, apparently, also no money for me to say no to that expense, and I watched my parents beam with a kind of pride I had never once seen directed at me. At the reception, my father stood up to give a toast, and through tears, actual tears, he said that no cost was too great for his little girl's happiness. The room applauded. I clapped too, because what else do you do, but something in my chest cracked that night that never fully healed. Here's where it gets worse, and I need you to keep listening, because what happened next is the reason I'm telling you this story at all. 2 years into medical school, drowning in debt, working nights at a research lab to cover rent because my parents had made it clear the money well was permanently dry where I was concerned, I got a call from my mother. She was crying. Not sad crying. The kind of crying people do when they need something. Melissa and Trevor's marriage was already falling apart, less than 2 years in, and Melissa wanted to go to graduate school for interior design, a field she'd casually mentioned interest in maybe twice in her whole life. My mother wanted to know if I could help. Not financially, she clarified quickly, since apparently even she understood I had nothing left to give. She wanted to know if I could write Melissa a strong letter of recommendation, using my medical school connections, to a design program that had nothing to do with medicine, because I was, in her words, the smart one and people would take a letter from a future doctor seriously. I laughed. I actually laughed out loud on the phone, and my mother got offended, genuinely offended, that I found this funny. I said no. It was the first time in my life I had said no to my mother about anything involving Melissa, and the silence on the other end of that phone call taught me more about my family than 26 years of living with them had. She called me selfish. She said after everything this family had done for me, I couldn't do this one small thing for my sister. I asked her, calmly, what exactly the family had done for me, and she hung up. We didn't speak for 4 months after that call. When we did speak again, it was because my grandmother, my mother's own mother, was in the hospital, and I was the one who drove 3 hours to sit with her every weekend while I was supposed to be studying for boards, because Melissa was, according to my mother, too fragile to handle hospitals. My grandmother, lucid in her final months in a way she hadn't been in years, held my hand one afternoon and told me something I've never forgotten. She said, Rachel, I watched what they did to you, and I'm sorry I never said anything when it mattered. Don't let them convince you that being useful is the same thing as being loved. She passed 2 weeks later, and in her will, quietly, without any family knowing beforehand, she left me a sum of money. Not an enormous fortune, but enough, combined with what I could scrape together, to pay off nearly half of my remaining loan balance. She'd apparently been watching for years, saying nothing, doing the math on her own, deciding silently that someone in this family needed to actually see me. I didn't tell my parents about the inheritance. I want to be honest about that, because there's a version of this story where I'm a perfect saint and that's not the version that's true. I kept it quiet, paid down my debt, and kept my head down through the rest of medical school and residency, for more brutal years, while my family's narrative about me solidified into something ugly. The story became that I had grown cold, distant, that success had changed me, that I'd forgotten where I came from. Nobody in that story ever mentioned the $40,000. Funny how that detail kept getting left out. Meanwhile, Melissa's marriage to Trevor ended in year 3. The design program never happened. She moved back in with my parents at 29 years old, and my mother, who had once told me there was no money for my tuition, apparently found money to help Melissa start a small event planning business, ironic given how her own wedding planning had gone. I heard about all of this secondhand, through my aunt, because by this point my parents and I spoke maybe 4 times a year, stiff, careful conversations that never touched anything real. I finished residency. I became an attending physician in emergency medicine, a specialty I chose partly, I'll admit, because it kept me too busy to think about family gatherings I wasn't invited to and didn't particularly want to attend anyway. Then, 3 years ago, my father had a heart attack. I got the call at 2 in the morning from my mother, hysterical, and something in me, despite everything, despite years of feeling like an afterthought in my own family, drove me straight to that hospital because he was still my father and I was still, underneath the scar tissue, someone who loved him. I walked into that ICU in scrubs because I'd come straight from a shift, and the cardiologist on call, a colleague of mine, briefed me on my father's condition using words my mother and Melissa clearly didn't understand and were too overwhelmed to ask about. I translated everything for them. I asked the right questions. I caught a medication interaction the on-call resident had missed, something that could have caused serious complications, and I flagged it before it became a problem. My mother watched me do all of this, watched the nurses defer to me, watched me hold my father's hand and speak to him calmly while inside I was screaming, and something shifted in her face that night. I saw it. A recognition, maybe, or a kind of shame she didn't have words for yet. My father recovered, slowly. And in the months after, something strange started happening. My mother started calling more. Not about anything specific at first, just checking in, which we had never really done before. I was cautious. I'd learned, by then, not to mistake attention for love, because in my family those two things had never actually been the same thing. About 8 months ago, the real reason for the calls finally surfaced. Melissa's event planning business had taken on debt, more than she could handle, chasing a lifestyle she'd built expecting a version of success that never quite arrived. She was engaged again, to a man named Daniel, and wanted, of course, another significant wedding, this time to prove something, I think, to herself as much as to anyone else. And her business debt, combined with wedding costs, had put my parents in a financial position where they were considering taking a second mortgage on the house. My mother called and asked, this time not for a letter of recommendation, not for a favor, but directly, for money. She said the words I will genuinely never forget as long as I live. She said, "Rachel, you're a doctor now, you make good money, surely you can help your sister the way we always helped you. The way we always helped me." I sat with the phone against my ear in complete silence for what felt like a full minute, letting that sentence exist in the air between us, and my mother, uncomfortable with silence the way she always had been, kept talking, kept filling the space, kept building a case for why family means sacrifice and why I, of all people, should understand that. I finally spoke, and I asked her one question. I asked her to tell me, specifically, in dollar amounts, everything the family had done to help me financially in my entire life. She fumbled. She mentioned the 1 semester of college tuition. She mentioned, absurdly, that they'd let me live at home rent-free the summer after undergrad, 4 months, in exchange for which I'd cooked and cleaned for the whole family and driven my grandmother to every doctor's appointment she had that summer. She could not name a single other thing, because there wasn't one, because I had built every single piece of my career, my degree, my license, my entire adult life, without a dollar of help from the people now asking me to fund their second attempt at a fairy tale wedding. I told her no. Calmly. Clearly. I told her I would not be giving Melissa money for her wedding or her business debt. What happened next is the part of this story that still, honestly, takes my breath away when I retell it. My mother did not accept the no. She escalated. She told me that if I didn't help, she would make sure the entire extended family knew what kind of daughter I really was. She said she'd tell everyone how I abandoned my sister in her time of need, how I'd grown too good for my own family, how success had made me heartless. She said, and this is a direct quote I will never forget, "Everyone already thinks you're cold, Rachel, this will just confirm it." That threat, that specific willingness to publicly humiliate me for refusing to hand over money I had never once been offered when I needed it, was the moment something in me finally, permanently, closed. I told her to do whatever she felt she needed to do, and I hung up the phone. 3 weeks later, my aunt called to tell me there was a family gathering being planned, technically for my father's birthday, but really, everyone understood, as a kind of intervention where the extended family would confront me about my treatment of Melissa. My mother had apparently been building this narrative for weeks, telling aunts, uncles, cousins, that I had turned my back on the family, that money had changed me, carefully leaving out every detail about the $40,000, the co-signed loan, the years of being told my sister simply mattered more. I almost didn't go. I want to be honest about that too. Every instinct I had told me to stay home, to let them have their gathering, to protect myself from a room full of people who'd already decided I was the villain. But something in me, maybe my grandmother's voice, maybe just 20 years of swallowed anger finally reaching its limit, told me I needed to be in that room. So I went. And I brought something with me nobody expected. I'd spent the 3 weeks since that phone call doing something my mother clearly hadn't anticipated. I'd gone through old emails, old bank statements from that period of my life, the loan documents from medical school, even a few old text messages I'd saved without really knowing why at the time, the ones where my mother explained in writing why Melissa's wedding deposit mattered more than my tuition gap. I'd printed exactly what I needed. Not everything. Just enough. The gathering was at my parents' house, maybe 18 people, aunts and uncles and cousins I hadn't seen in years, all of them looking at me with a kind of practiced sympathy that made my skin crawl because I understood immediately they'd already been told a story where I was the cold one, the selfish one, the daughter who'd forgotten where she came from. My mother stood up not long after the cake was served and said she wanted to address something as a family, and she began, gently at first, talking about how important family sacrifice was, how she'd always taught her daughters to support one another, how disappointed she was that one of her daughters seemed to have forgotten that lesson. She was talking about me. To a room full of people. In my parents' living room. On what was supposed to be my father's birthday. I let her finish. I want you to understand that I let her finish completely, every word, because I needed the room to hear her full narrative before I offered mine. When she sat down, I stood up. I said I wanted to share something too, since we were apparently having a family conversation about sacrifice and support. I said I had some documents I thought the family might find informative, and I began reading, calmly, without raising my voice even once, from the printed pages in my hand. I read the text message where my mother told me, in writing, that Melissa's wedding deposit came before my tuition. I read the email where she explained that Melissa was, quote, not built like me and couldn't push through things the way I could. I read the exact dollar figures, the $90,000 wedding, the $40,000 deposit sent while I signed a private loan at a punishing interest rate because nobody in this family would co-sign for me the way they'd co-signed loans for uncles and cousins before. The room went silent in a way I don't think I'll ever forget. My aunt, who I later learned had been one of the loudest voices pushing for this whole intervention, had her hand over her mouth. My uncle, my father's own brother, looked at my mother with an expression I'd never seen him wear before. I finished by saying I hadn't come here for an apology, and I hadn't come here for money either, since apparently that was the currency this family understood best. I said I'd come because I was done letting people who'd never once shown up for me decide, from a distance, what kind of daughter I was. My father, still recovering, still fragile from his heart attack, looked at my mother with an expression of genuine shock, and he said, quietly, is this true, did we really do that to her? And my mother, for the first time in my entire life, had absolutely nothing to say. Melissa, who'd been sitting quietly through all of this, finally spoke, and what she said surprised me more than anything else that night. She said she'd always known, on some level, that things had been unequal, but she'd let herself believe it was fine because it benefited her, and she was sorry, genuinely sorry, in a way that felt different from anything I'd heard from her before. I want to tell you that everything got neatly resolved that night, tied up with a bow, but real life doesn't work that way. What actually happened was quieter, and slower, and in some ways more meaningful. My aunts and uncles, the ones who'd been ready to lecture me an hour earlier, started asking Melissa and my mother pointed questions about the wedding money, about the business debt, about a pattern several of them admitted they'd noticed over the years but never said anything about because it wasn't their business. My mother sat through nearly an hour of her own family gently, and not so gently, holding up a mirror she'd spent decades avoiding. My father, in the weeks that followed, did something I never expected. He called me, alone, and apologized, really apologized, not the deflecting half apology I'd gotten used to, but a real one, where he took responsibility and didn't ask me to make him feel better about it afterward. He told me the heart attack had changed how he thought about time, about what mattered, and that watching me work that night in the ICU, calm and competent and clearly excellent at what I did, had made him ask himself how he'd ever convinced himself my future mattered less than anyone else's. My mother's apology took longer, almost a year, and honestly I'm not sure it would have come at all if the rest of the family hadn't kept quietly holding her accountable in ways I wasn't even present for. When it finally came, it wasn't perfect. She still, even in her apology, tried once to mention how hard things had been for her too, and I had to gently redirect her back to actually taking responsibility instead of spreading it around evenly. But it was something. It was more than I'd ever gotten before. Melissa and I are still rebuilding, slowly, carefully. Her second wedding to Daniel happened quietly, at a courthouse, paid for entirely by the two of them, and she told me afterward that after everything that came out that night, she couldn't imagine asking anyone in the family for a single dollar toward it, and that the wedding, small as it was, felt more like hers than the Cabo wedding ever had. I believe her. I think some part of her had known for years that $90,000 weddings don't actually fix broken things, they just distract from them beautifully for a few hours. I paid off the last of my medical school loans 2 years ago, standing in my kitchen, making a final online payment on a debt that had shaped 15 years of my life. I didn't cry the way I expected to. I mostly just felt tired, in a good way, the way you feel after finally putting down something heavy you've been carrying so long you forgot what your arms felt like without it. If there's a lesson in any of this, and I've had a lot of time to think about what it is, it's this. Love that only shows up as a ledger, keeping score of who deserves support and who's expected to manage on their own, isn't really love, it's a transaction wearing love's clothing. Families like to talk about sacrifice as if it's automatically noble, but sacrifice without fairness is just another word for neglect, dressed up nicely for the people who benefit from it. I don't regret paying my own way through medical school. In some strange way it made me who I am, steady under pressure, unwilling to be intimidated by hard things, because I'd already done the hardest thing life had asked of me before I ever set foot in a hospital as a doctor. But I do think about the 22-year-old version of me sitting on that bathroom floor, and I wish someone had told her sooner that being the strong one isn't the same as being valued, and that you're allowed to stop proving yourself to people who never once stopped to actually see you. My family is different now, not perfect, but different, more honest, in a way that took a heart attack and a room full of relatives and years of quiet resentment finally spoken aloud to get us to. Some wounds don't fully close, they just stop bleeding and start teaching you something instead. I think that's the most honest ending I can give you, because life rarely hands you a perfect one, but it does, if you're patient and honest enough, sometimes hand you a true one.